What would you say is the best time period in history? Personally, I'd have to go with ancient Egypt. That was a time of building pyramids and creating some of the most incredible works of art known to man. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a journey back in time to ancient Egypt. We will look at how they made their bread, their beer, and even what kids did for fun back then. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe. Egyptians had many different styles of homes, but no matter where you were in the empire, one thing stayed constant. Houses always faced north to catch any scrap of breeze possible. This is because Egypt is located in a desert. In fact, summer temperatures would reach as high as 46 degrees Celsius. To help cope with the heat, Egyptians slept during the day and worked at night. Their houses were built from mud brick, which helped keep them cool. Mud bricks were simply mud and straw mixed together and dried in the sun. They were usually made in a rectangular shape, but sometimes round houses could be found near the coast. Homes were either freestanding or built around courtyards. They also liked to build their homes in circular shapes. Most homes would have one room, but wealthier citizens would have multiple rooms. In fact, the richest homes had 2 stories and included things like bathrooms and libraries. Because of the lack of running water, bathrooms were often just a hole in the floor. Sounds kinda familiar, you know, like an outhouse. Along the walls, they would often put a raised bed made out of wood or stone. Above that would be a shelf to hold clothing and other belongings. Some homes even had colorful wall paintings. People would store their grains in large jars and use the stairs on the wall to reach them. While the wealthy had nice homes, the poor lived in one room, homes that may have shared walls with other families. There wasn't much privacy. In these homes, people slept, ate, and welcomed guests, all in the same room. Families would typically share their home with servants and animals. And the one benefit of living in a small space is that it's easier to stay cool. Egyptians were pretty smart when it came to finding a place to live. They chose to build their cities along the River Nile because it provided fresh water and fertile land. The Nile River is the longest river in the world, stretching over 4,000 miles. It is also considered to be the longest river in the ancient world. Life revolved around the Nile River. The Egyptians believed the river's annual flooding gave them a new life each year. It was a gift from the gods. The upper part of the river started near the city of Cairo and extended south. Lower Egypt started in the Mediterranean Sea and moved north. This is interesting because the Egyptians actually named these regions based on their location relative to the sun. Upper Egypt was closer to the equator, so they called it Upper. Lower Egypt was farther away from the sun, so they named it Lower. I guess back then they weren't worried about hurting anyone's feelings. Also, unlike today, the Nile River was wider. Many ancient Egyptian cities were built on islands in the river. One of the largest cities was Thebes. It was situated on a massive island in the middle of the Nile. Along the banks, you would find many palm trees, papyrus plants, and green grasses. Life was good if you lived by the Nile. Farming was the main economic activity. Crops such as wheat, barley, and flax grew well in the fertile soil. The soil was so fertile that farmers only had to farm every other year. They didn't want to risk wearing the soil out. Farmers relied heavily on the Nile River to water their crops. After the yearly flood, the river would recede and leave behind silt, which made the soil extremely rich. Animals such as cows, sheep, and geese could roam freely on the farm. Farmers used the river to transport goods. They would load up their produce and take it to local markets. Sometimes it was easier to travel by boat than to walk. Boats were also used as a form of transportation to get around the country. Since Egypt was mostly flat, boats were the quickest way to move from north to south. Even though the Nile was very useful, it could also be dangerous. From time to time, the river would flood, destroying homes and farmland. This is why the Egyptians worshipped the river as a god. They wanted to stay on his good side. The ancient Egyptians invented a device to predict the yearly flooding. It was called a rekith. It was a wooden stake with markings on it. Every year the water level rose. The record would get closer and closer to the top. When the water began receding, they could see how much the river had flooded by measuring the distance between the richt height and the waterline. They used this information to determine when to plant crops. Farmers would grow crops in the fall. Wheat and barley were the most important crops, because they were used to make bread and beer. The beer was given to workers to drink and help them work long hours. You think that beer would have less alcohol than today's beer. Actually, it had a higher percentage of alcohol. Ancient Egyptians baked their own bread. The dough was made out of flour and water. After it rested, they would roll it out and cut it into pieces. Then the bread was ready to bake. To bake the bread, they heated up a stone oven to 335 degrees Celsius. They would only leave the bread in for 20 minutes. That's a lot shorter than the 40 minutes or more that we wait for our breads today. The reason they left it in for such a short time is that Egyptian bread was extremely flat. Unlike our thick slices of bread, theirs looked more like a tortilla. Once the bread was baked, it was ready to eat. They would spread a type of butter on it and maybe add some fruit. Sometimes they would have vegetables or cheese on their bread. And of course, they always had beer to wash it down. Children had a much different life than we did. Back then, children were expected to help out around the house and learn how to read and write. Many boys were sent to live with another family to learn their trade. They were basically like apprentices. Boys would become scribes, builders or farmers. Girls would stay home and learn how to cook and clean. When they weren't busy working, kids would play games just like we did. One game they played was called Mahon. It was kind of like checkers. The goal of the game was to capture your opponent's pieces. Another game they played was called Sanot. It was similar to players raced their pieces around the board, trying to be the first to get all the way around. Sometimes the Egyptians would play with balls. They played a sport that involved kicking a ball around. It sounds kind of like soccer, doesn't it? The Egyptians loved sports. They participated in wrestling matches, weightlifting contests, and running races. They even had their own Olympics. It was called the Festival of the Beautiful Slaying. Athletes from all over Egypt would come and compete. The winner received an olive branch. Kind of makes you wonder, are ancient Olympic medals really that much better than an olive branch? Egypt was the first great civilization to grace the earth. It was the first to do many things, including invent paper. So in a way, ancient Egypt was like the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. Everything seemed so new and exciting. Imagine being one of the first people to ever see a pyramid. How does that make you feel? What about seeing the Sphinx for the first time? All of these wonders were built by the hands of men. No machines, just sheer determination and hard work. This was a time before iPhones, iPads, and even electricity, yet somehow they managed to invent so many things without these modern conveniences. We tend to think of ancient Egypt as a primitive time, but compared to other civilizations, they were very advanced. They had figured out how to read and write. They understood the concept of zero. They also invented the first crude microscope. It was a piece of glass with two convex lenses. With it, they could magnify small objects up to 30 times. Well, there you have it. A little taste of what life was like in ancient Egypt. Remember, this was a time when everything was new. They were doing things for the first time. This was a time of great art and innovation. Thanks for watching.